Who do you think is the worst agent in Valorant's entire history? Yoru before the rework? Deadlock on release? Maybe even Chamber after his nerfs? No matter who you're thinking of, you're probably forgetting someone. Viper during Valorant's beta. She was laughably weak for a whole host of reasons, arguably the worst any agent has ever been. But if Viper was so terrible, what led to her becoming one of the most picked agents in the game just 1 year after beta? This is the story of Viper's rise to power in Valorant's competitive scene over the course of 2 years, and how she solidified her position as one of the strongest agents in the game for years to come. Viper was one of the original 10 agents that were available when Valorant's beta launched back in April of 2020. During beta and for a while after launch, there were only 3 controllers in the game, and Brimstone was easily the strongest out of all of them. His abilities were easy to understand and powerful, something that could not be said about Omen's selfish abilities or Viper's strange mechanics. But even Omen was decent enough to compete, while Viper was considered by almost everybody to be the worst agent in the game by far. So, what gives? For starters, no one really knew how to play her. Her kit was one of the most unique in the game, with elements of resource management and room for intricate setups and lineups. Her abilities were much worse than they are today. Her smokes in particular were probably the worst in the game with how hard they were to place and how little damage the decay actually did. Her screen didn't go through walls and couldn't be placed before the round started. Her smokes decayed teammates. She only had 50 fuel at the start of the round. The list goes on. Riot's first attempt of many to buff Viper came in patch .50, increasing the radius and height of her snakebite, as well as a small quality of life buff for her poison orb. These buffs were obviously not enough, though it is worth mentioning that Omen was also buffed in this patch, which would eventually lead to his dominance of the controller meta for many months after launch. When Valorant fully launched in June of 2020, Viper was stuck between a rock and a hard place, with Cypher and Sage being the strongest agents in the game by far, and Brimstone still being the best controller. Viper's Sentinel-like qualities were unnecessary in a meta that was already being dominated by Sentinels, and her smokes were nowhere near good enough to make playing her as a solo controller worthwhile. Pretty much every team was playing double Sentinel, so playing double controller wasn't really an option unless you wanted to drop your Sova or Duelist. Her pick rates in early tournaments like the Twitch Rivals Tourney or the T1 x NSG Showdown were abysmal, and in late June Riot took another shot at balancing Viper in patch 1.2. Her screen was changed to go through walls, which was very welcome, and her molly was reworked to apply the fragile effect, or the vulnerable effect as it's called now, though the damage of the actual molly was cut in half. The last change to Viper in this patch was actually a nerf though, increasing the activation cooldown of her poison orb. To be honest, I'm not really sure what this means either. I think there's a typo in this change somewhere, but I don't know what it's supposed to say. I'm not even sure what an activation cooldown is, but the details aren't too important. This change was intended to make Viper's one-ways, which were arguably the best part of her kit, a little bit easier to deal with. Despite being a nerf to the worst agent in the game, this change was well received, since one-ways are just not very fun to play against. A month after this set of balance changes, Viper finally got some worthwhile buffs in patch 1.4. The decay per second in her smokes was buffed, as well as changing the decay to stay for a short time before fading. Her fuel was buffed to not consume any additional fuel if you put up both the orb and the wall, and her ultimate got some nice quality of life buffs. It was immediately clear that these buffs still weren't enough though, with her pick rate remaining around 0 to 5% in Ignition Series tournaments. The meta hadn't shifted much since launch, so Viper was still struggling to find her place, though it is worth mentioning that Omen had since taken over Brimstone's spot as the best controller by this point. The balance team still wasn't happy with Viper's performance, so she got another batch of improvements in patch 1.7. All of her smokes abilities were changed to not decay teammates anymore, thank god for that, and she gained the ability to place her wall before the round started, as well as a couple more small buffs. These changes were nice, and they definitely made her more fun to play, but they were still nowhere near enough to make Viper a competitive pick. Unsurprisingly, her pick rate stayed at around 0 to 5% in the last few Ignition Series tourneys. Her average pick rate across the entire Riot-supported Ignition series of tournaments was 1.6%, the lowest out of every agent in the game by far. Normally I would mention what map an agent was mostly being played on by now, but Viper just wasn't being played at all. Most of her little playtime was on either Split or Bind due to some nasty one-ways or setups she had access to, but she still couldn't compete with Cypher and Omen. Double Sentinel was much worse now than it had been at launch with all the nerfs Sage had gotten, opening up space in the team for potential second controller, although most teams ended up running Double Initiator or Double Duelist. The buff barrage continued in patch 1.9, doubling the amount of fuel she has at the start of the round and making the vulnerable effect on her molly linger for a couple of seconds, as well as making her ultimate a little less punishing to place. This was her 4th set of buffs in 4 months, so surely by now she would at least be worth trying, right? Her first chance for redemption was at Valorant First Strike, the first ever Riot hosted tournament series with competitions around the globe, and it still wasn't looking good. Viper's average pick rate in First Strike was a whopping 3.2%, double what it was in the Ignition series, but still abysmal. To be fair to her though, in some regions she wasn't even the least picked agent. She even got a pick rate over 10% in Japan. So, even after all those buffs, Viper was still terrible. All of the problems I mentioned earlier had been fixed by now, except for one. Her smokes still just couldn't compete with Brimstone's or Omen's more traditional smokes for a myriad of reasons. These problems were not exclusive to pro play either, as Viper was also the least played agent and ranked by far. However, a very dedicated community was starting to build around Viper, with videos showing off lineups and setups on different maps getting hundreds of thousands of views. There were a ton of different ways to play Viper, from lurking every round for kills to playing a heavy post-plant setup with mollies and an orb on the bomb. Something about playing the worst character in any given game always seems to bond people together, especially with someone as unique as Viper. It's also worth mentioning that Icebox came out during First Strike, although it was only played a few times across every region. After First Strike and in the beginning of 2021, there was a bit of a break from everything, with no official tournaments or Viper changes until the Stage 1 Challengers events that started up in February. As the Challengers tournaments began though, it was immediately clear that something had changed. Viper had finally found her place in the meta, and that place was Icebox. Her ability to block off multiple angles with just her wall made her the ideal agent for a map as open as Icebox, especially when combined with her one-ways and insane post-plant potential. But despite Viper's obvious prowess on the map, she still just wasn't a very good agent in general, so Omen often took the controller spot on Icebox. Her average pick rate across every Stage 1 Challengers event turned out to be 7.4%, a massive improvement from First Strike, but she still had a long way to go. All of those Challengers events were leading up to VCT Stage 1 Masters, a series of official regional tournaments across the world where teams would compete to be crowned the best in their region. Viper's pick rate across every tournament was 11.4%, quite a bit higher than it had ever been before. Her pick rate had been steadily increasing ever since launch, and the buffs she had gotten in the release of Icebox had served her quite well. But she still had one glaring problem that was keeping her from being truly meta. Her smokes were still just too easy to ignore and push through, especially her wall. So, Riot decided to fix that problem once and for all, and accidentally made a monster.
What's first on the list? The Viper updates?
Viper.
Alright. Walk me through it, somebody that actually read this earlier.
Oxen. Massive.
You're gonna literally walk me through it. You're gonna literally read all of the words.
For one.
Well, the main thing at the top here is that the enemies that cross through all of the Viper things now, you just instantly take 50 decay from just touching any of Viper's utility.
That's ridiculous.
Which is very significant.
It used to be you would minus 15 per second. Now it's minus 10, so that's a little bit of a nerf. But it's still this is a big buff if it's working as we think. And then this is also kind of a nerf, but it's to make up that you lose 50 health instantly. Poison Cloud can now immediately be redeployed and picked up, but grants a temporary charge instead of a permanent charge. I think this is really big.
When a Viper dies, the Poison Cloud and Toxic Screen will remain up for an additional 2 seconds or until Viper runs out of fuel, meaning that if Viper only has 7 fuel left and it rescinds in about a second, it's not going to stay up for 2, right?
Her Snakebite equip time decreased from 1.1 to 0.8. I think this is good too. It would take forever to pull it out, and like you didn't have time if they're rushing you, pull out the molly, throw it, and pull the gun back out. Maybe this will help it. I mean, it's 0.3 seconds, so...
These are good changes. Like, they don't seem broken, but they seem very useful. This changes the way you look at an enemy Viper. It really does.
This was an insane set of buffs, to say the least. It's also worth noting that in patch 2.5, Viper got a few tiny changes to her smokes that were not mentioned in the patch notes. These small changes led to the discovery of the swoop peak, where you sit inside of your poison orb and you can see the enemy way before they see you. With all these buffs and even a new tech, Viper was ready to dominate the meta. But there's one last thing I forgot to mention. Back in patch 2.4, Valorant got its first new controller, Astra. On release, Astra seemed pretty underwhelming, but now that it had been a few weeks since her launch, people had learned how to play her and had figured out that she was insanely powerful. So now, Viper had to compete with another very strong controller, but they were mostly played on different maps from each other, so it wasn't too much of a problem for Viper. Viper got her first opportunity to show her strength in the Challengers Qualifiers tournaments leading up to Masters Reykjavik, Valorant's first official international tournament. Her pick rate across every Challengers region was a whopping 16.7%, a decent improvement from Masters Stage 1, but still not that high. The earlier Challengers tournaments took place right after patch 2.6 though, so people were still trying to figure out how to incorporate Viper. This also showed in her ranked pick rates, where she had a pick rate of 21.4%, which was much better than it used to be but was still not really showing her full strength. Viper would get her first real chance to shine at Masters Reykjavik, but before it could begin, Viper got her first real nerf in patch 2.9. The instant decay from entering her smokes was decreased from 50 decay to 30, nearly cutting it in half. Riot explained that they were trying to find a good balance point in between her smokes being easily ignorable and her smokes being impossible to push through. This nerf also changed a lot of interactions with certain guns, most notably the Marshal, which used to be able to one-shot any enemies that walked through her smoke with just a body shot, basically turning into a temporary operator. But despite this nerf, Viper was still very strong, and her pick rate of 49% at Masters Reykjavik was proof of that. 49% was an insane jump from all of her previous pick rates, and she was actually the most picked controller for the first time ever. Most of her playtime was once again on Icebox, with the typical Icebox comp looking something like this. Double controller comps were also gaining popularity, but they were still not the standard and were dependent on the map and how comfortable the team was with trying new things. Speaking of maps though, about a month before Reykjavik started, Breeze was released in patch 2.8. I didn't mention Breeze until now because it wasn't in the map pool at Reykjavik, since it was so new. Breeze was very similar to Icebox in that it was a very open map, the most open in the game by far, and that made Viper a perfect choice for a controller. No other smoke could cover as many angles as Viper's wall could, and Brimstone and Omen had trouble placing their smokes in the first place since the map was so big, so Viper was a perfect pick for the map. Soon after Reykjavik ended, the VCT Challengers event started up again, this time leading up to Masters Stage 3 Berlin. But in the middle of these tournaments, patch 3.0 was dropped, buffing or nerfing every agent in the game, including Viper. The duration of her molly was reduced from 8 seconds to 6.5 seconds, and its price was doubled. This is the only nerf she got in this patch though, and while it was definitely a decent nerf that would hurt her ability to stall pushes and stop defuses, the rest of her kit was still just as strong. Astra was not so lucky, as all of her abilities except her ult got hit with nerfs. It's also worth noting that in patch 3.1, Riot accidentally shipped the change to Viper's ultimate, causing the clad to expand from the indicator instead of from Viper, but that was fixed a couple patches later. Viper's pick rate in the Stage 3 Challengers tourneys was 45.5%, not much different from what it was at Reykjavik, and she had 100% pick rate on Breeze and Icebox in most regions. Not much changed from the end of Challengers to the beginning of Masters Berlin, so her pick rate in Berlin was 48%. Once again, very solid, but nothing we hadn't seen before by now. A new meta was starting to rise on maps like Bind and Split though. Astra Viper Double Controller. Astra's and Viper's abilities were insanely strong when used together, with absurd post plants with pulls and mollies, and site executes that were impossible to defend against. This comp was only really played on Bind and Split though, since Viper was bad on Haven and Ascent and Astra just wasn't necessary on Breeze and Icebox with how good Viper was in those maps. After Masters Berlin, all was quiet for about a month until the start of the Champions Last Chance qualifier tournaments in October, except for one thing. In patch 3.7, Riot changed the way the visuals of Viper's smokes worked in order to remove any type of peeker's advantage gained from playing inside of the smoke, effectively killing the swoop peak. Or it was supposed to kill it, at least. Immediately after this patch came the beginning of the Champs LCQ tourneys, where teams were using the best strategies and comps available to try and secure a spot at Champions. As a result of this, Viper's pick rate across every region was 49.5%, her highest yet by a small amount. The entire year of VCT tournaments had been leading up to one thing: Valorant Champions 2021 in Berlin. At Champions, Viper had a pick rate of 58%, once again her highest yet. Not much had changed since Berlin, though Astra Viper Double Controller had been solidified as the best comp on Split and Bind, as well as seeing some play on Fracture, the newest map in the game at the time. She still had a 100% pick rate on Icebox and Breeze, and it didn't look like anything was going to change anytime soon. 2021 had been a great year for Viper, but all great things must come to an end. So as Champions finished up with Ascent taking home the trophy and 2021 ended, the controller meta seemed set in stone, and Viper had a bright future in front of her. This is the first of 2 videos covering the entire history of Viper. The second part should be coming out in the beginning of April, if all goes well. I wasn't originally planning on splitting it into 2 parts like this, but splitting it just made the most sense for my schedule since it was taking so absurdly long to make. With all of that said, subscribe if you enjoyed and consider joining the Discord server, and I'll see you next time.